Cheerio. Thanks for joining us. Let's talk about Benjamin Britten's opera Peter Grimes today, and the few orchestral interludes that can be excerpted from it. And in addition to those, we're certainly going to also be talking about another Peter today, Benjamin Britten's lifelong partner, Peter Pears, as well, the well-known singer. Now they had the pleasure of meeting each other just around the time of the outset of the Second World War. Just a few years after composers like Arnold Schoenberg and Erich Korngold were able to resettle more safely in the United States, Britten and Pears took advantage of an opportunity to tour in the States. Especially by that time, London was being bombed by the Nazis, so Britten was able to get out and did plenty of work in the States while he was there. And perhaps ironically, it was actually while he was in California that he encountered this beautiful poem by a poet from Suffolk, England, George Crabbe. And despite the content of the poem, Peter Grimes, this is not a sea creature that has written poetry. This is certainly human subject matter, but nonetheless, Britten starts to feel homesick for England. So despite the beautiful California sunshine, he's drawn to this poem and the idea of setting it to an opera. And so he and Pears, I guess, decide that, well, maybe they miss the English weather. I appreciate that Brits don't necessarily need to be, lying back, sunbathing with a cocktail to have a good time. And Britten's not the only one who was able to appreciate the rocky coast that they have there outside of music and literature. For example, the great Virginia Woolf, she's able to see the inconveniences of having to organize and host a party, but is able to depict that in a very nuanced and perceptive way with plenty of drama in her wonderful work, Mrs. Dalloway. And outside of literature, we have in humor, we have our friends over there in Monty Python. They're certainly using their imagination.
It is the most elusive fish.
That was terrific!
Great, yeah! Best bit, fantastic!
So in the early 1940s, Britten and Pears decide to settle back in this East England little fishing village of Aldeburgh, the kind of place where folks in London can just get out there to spend the weekend, maybe at a second home, and everyone can try to coexist with the local fishermen there. And it requires a little bit of delicacy from Britten and Pears, just generally speaking in England as well, because at this point in time, homosexuality is still a criminal act, and that would continue to be the case for a couple more decades as well. So nonetheless, they're able to find support and live a relatively quiet life there in this small town of Aldeburgh and what's called their Red House, which is sort of off in the countryside. And we can see signs of them being embraced there in Aldeburgh. For example, they're now buried very prominently outside the local church and its cemetery. And inside that church, there's a beautiful series of stained glass windows that depict scenes from 3 of Britten's operas. And as we'll see a little bit later, there's also this beautiful sculpture that was commissioned later in memory of Britten. We see this scallop shell on the beach, or what we might call a beach there in England. So Britten and Pears established the Aldeburgh Festival in the early 1940s, and then worked for a couple of decades to build their small passion project into a festival that garnered an international reputation, and eventually, in the process of expanding, was able to take over a local maltings facility and convert that into a big and beautiful concert hall. But it wasn't until 1968 that a public official, the head of state, the Queen of England, was able to recognize what they had done. And that was because that was just a few months after that England had voted to decriminalize homosexuality. So she took advantage of that opportunity to recognize one of England's greatest couples and artists, and at that time was able to tie the work that they had done there at the Aldeburgh Festival into the pride of the nation and of the empire. This was the place for them. And this is the place where Britten set his, magnificent opera, Peter Grimes, from which these 4 orchestral movements are taken to end up with the 4 Sea Interludes from Peter Grimes. This fishing village, the sites, the buildings of this town are the setting for the opera. And in addition to that, it has arguably an autobiographical element to it as well, because it's basically about the struggle of the individual to find acceptance in their community, to not necessarily feel like the outsider, and also, to have that acceptance within oneself as well. Is this turmoil between you and your neighbor, or is it, is it within yourself? Are you feeling like your own worst enemy? I'm Benjamin Britten, and this is my masterclass. It's something that you would not have heard in his day. Throughout much of history, if you wanted to learn from a master, you had to earn the right to become their apprentice. And this could be a complicated scenario because, there's understandably not going to be an equal power dynamic in that situation. It doesn't always work out the way that it did for young Mr. Skywalker in Star Wars. Usually you're going to feel the brunt of your master. Even the greats such as Mozart and Beethoven had parents that, they could never sort of escape the shadow of. So since this is an opera, and ultimately a tragic opera, things don't go well for the fisherman Peter Grimes and his young apprentice out at sea. But despite that, we're led to believe that maybe things could be beautiful. I mean, the opera opens with this music that's ultimately peaceful and connects to the line that he says much later in the opera, "What harbor shelters peace?" And he wonders this because no matter where he goes or what he does, unfortunate events seem to follow him. But at the beginning of the opera, we don't know this, and we're given the illusion that we're just in a beautiful, seaside fishing village, and it's a lovely day, and we're going to meet this Peter Grimes guy and see what happens. So the beginning of the opera is where this first of the 4 Sea Interludes comes. And it paints a beautiful morning, the still waters with the sun rising, represented by the flutes and the violins, these 20 or 30 people in complete, stillness and unison. And then it's said that the next sounds that we hear are these gulls passing through, and eventually we hear the tide coming in. The tide comes in and ebbs in and out. For something to be tonal music, it implies that the chords that are in the music have a function, and that it's that purpose and that relationship between these different chords that amounts to having a function or them being tonal. There's a tonal center and they have a function. They move in certain ways that are dictated by certain traditions of music making or the craft of music. So to be bitonal means that there are two different kinds of tonality that are existing simultaneously. There are some spots in this piece by Britten where that more or less is happening. It happens somewhat because I think true bitonality would be very sort of confusing to listen to. So he'll let one thing go a little bit out of focus where something that's contrasting will sort of pull you in a different direction. Sometimes pulling you apart, and sometimes they get closer to one another. But it's, in my opinion, it's able to sort of paint this story of Peter Grimes as somebody who's being pulled in different directions and being pulled away from himself. He doesn't feel comfortable with himself or with his peers. So there you heard this wonderful moment in Sunday morning where the music of the people gathering outside on their way to church is juxtaposed with the music of the church bells. So we have this sort of overlapping bitonality. And later it gets even more dissonant when the church bell is ringing at a much more regular rate in what will eventually become later the new home pitch of E flat, and we think to ourselves, okay, are these warning tolls? You know, is this how does this relate to Peter Grimes? You know, is this the fact that yet another one of his young apprentices has died? Is it that because there's a storm coming? This next movement, there's this wonderful moment where you start with one key area, then you're adding instruments and you're adding pitches until you eventually have a second entire chord present. and then eventually after that you've added up to a third whole chord present, so maybe you have 9 or 10 different pitches present that sort of clears out into this beautiful peaceful moment and climax in Moonlight. Let's listen to that to start. So it's really the music that makes this opera so compelling. The libretto itself is not so complicated. There aren't very many characters or plot twists. What we do is we feel the turmoil of Peter Grimes. You know, the weather is a metaphor for what's going on with him inside. So, you know, even though the struggle is a bit ambiguous in terms of its story, and, you know, Benjamin Britten has certainly hidden any possible sort of homoerotic readings into this story. Nonetheless, we can feel the pain and the struggle of Grimes, and perhaps because of that, it allows each of us to sort of read our own struggles into this character. This reminds me of the memorial to Britten that can be seen just outside of town on the coast, and the inscription on the sculpture. You know, to hear these unheard voices is a line from Peter Grimes that ties it, you know, sort of ties it all together. You know, the more pages of the score for the piece that I turned, the more hesitant I became about whether we should actually do this piece and whether I should force my university students to pull it off, because it requires a lot of playing all over the place from every musician. But ultimately, I guess I hoped that the inspiring nature of the music would pull people to rise to the challenge, and that's ultimately what happened. And I'm grateful that we were able to do it together. I guess Britten envisioned a lot to be able to convey both the incredible stormy nature of the piece and also the calm within the storm that occasionally is revealed within this movement. It certainly doesn't give anybody, you know, necessarily a good feeling as they listen to the end of this piece, but it's a brutal realism. It is climactic, but it's very brutal. But that's how life sometimes is. You know, we're recording this during the coronavirus pandemic, and this is the way that Britten saw things. You know, we don't know. I personally don't know how he interacted with those around him and whether maybe he seemed perfectly content, but he certainly saw these storms around him, and that's very evident in this opera and in this final interlude to Peter Grimes.